Hello, my name is Rafael Batiste. I am professor of agrometeorology and crop modeling at the University Federal of Goiás. And today we are talking about the crop modeling conceptions and applicability. We are going to talk about how is the main point that you need to look when you're building a model or when you're using a crop model for agriculture purpose. The first uh, detail that I want to share with you is that the model the essence of the modeling is formulate the image of a system. So when you are working with this crop model, we need to define what is the system, how does the system works, how is it be used this model. So you need to define this condition to building a model or to use a correct model to make the simulation that you need to get the outputs and the results to make a decision, a management decision based in this information that you are simulating. So here we have an example of a system. We have first here just one plant of soybean. You can look to this plant and make a lot of images about how this plant grows. For example, we can define the number of leaf, the height of this crop, how the crop makes the photosynthesis, how the chemical composition of this plant. You can make a lot of simulation and bring a lot of details for this single plant that you have here. So this interspecific competition define how the model make this partitioning of solar radiation and the soil water content for these three plants on or another plants that you have in this field, and you can make use this principle to define how is the best plant density for our environment based in the weather and other conditions that you have in this site. Another point is the interspecific competition. Then when you have another plants that are not our aim in this field, we can include this and how these plants can penalize the yield for the main crop. So you can include also this in the model. So you can saw here that you have our main crop, other crops, this competition between these two crops, and between the principal crop in the system, but you also can include another things to represent this system. One example is the soil. So you have the plant, you have this competition, you have the soil that you define the chemical condition that the crop will be using for take the yield and the other composition. So we can have in this soil a physical limitation, a chemical and a biological limitation that can affect the yield, and you can include all these factors in our model or look for models that make this simulation. For example, in the DSAT model, we can building a soil profile to represent this and make some calibrations to adjust the root growth for the crop based in this information from soil. Another thing that this model can do is make the simulation of biological condition. For example, for soybean, the biological fixation nitrogen, the model can simulate this and make all the costs that the crop have to make this fixation and penalize yield when you have this limitation of nitrogen in the system. So we are increasing our system. We start with just one plant. We put more plants, put another crops in the system that are competition with this main crop. We put the soil, put the biological, physical, and chemical limitation in the system. And now you can also include the weather condition. So we have solar radiation, air temperature, photo period, and CO2 affecting the crop, and also rainfall can be included in this system that will affect the water available to the crop. And associated with this, we have this rainfall associated with the soil type. We can make this calculation to define the available soil water to the crop, and these are affecting our system and affecting the yield in the system. So to finalize, we can put also the pest and disease in the soil and in the plant that will affect our system. So you can make all these uh, components to be included in our model to make our yield prediction more right and get a good result for this. But for another point, when you put all this information in the model, we need to make calibration and define well this process and how each component are interact with them to make a right simulation in the model. So this is the essence of the modeling. We need to formulate an image of our system looking for each end we want to respond in this system and each results we want to look after our simulation. So most of the model not include pest and disease. The soil, you have most models looking for available soil in available water in the soil, and we don't have too much details about the chemical. We look more for nitrogen, and you make some calibrations to get this different level of yield limitation. For another things, the answer to weather and to plant density, most of mod can do this, and you're gonna make some example in the next class. So after that, you can start to make some definition about the models, and we have this reference that the models are classified in four main groups, based in what the models can do and how they represent systems. The first definition is a model that is conceptual, that describes a system and how it works. So it's more a writing about how we are looking for our system. For example, we know that solar radiation defines the potential yield. This is just a describing that the yield is affected by solar radiation. We can make this conceptual model to understand how our system works to make it the next step, that is to building a mathematical model. The second classification is a schematic model that illustrates the representation of a system, and it's including their components and the relationship between them. That was the example that I showed to you before, that you have this schematic condition that represents the different components in the model and how they are interacting. So it's a theoretical definition, and we include this schematic draw of how the model or how the image are being built. Another example, another definition is a physical model that they represent a system like a model or replica where you're building in a small size how our system works. We don't use too much this in agriculture. And the last one that will be the main part of our study is a mathematical model that describes a system using mathematical language, developing equation for each part of the system, and describe how processes are interrelation. So this, after we have this conceptual schematic, we get this information and build equation that represent how the plant make the photosynthesis, how the plant make transpiration, how much the crop is transpirating, and based on this equation, we building different relationship between them to make a model more realistic based on the image that we have from the system. So we are looking for this different type of model, but we work more with the mathematical model that will be used to represent the development, growth, and yield of crop based on the environmental condition that you have in the system. So to make more easily to us to understand uh, 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 the model conception, I bring here a very simple example about how the crop model can be building, or how the crop model can represent the crop grow. Here is an example that first we need to define our problem, what we want to solve. In this example, we have the simple question that can sugarcane yield supply a new mill? So we are looking for if a specific region can produce a level of yield that can make possible I can put a new mill in this region to produce sugar or ethanol. So here we start from a background about crop yield, that we know that energy in the system can define the potential yield of the system. So first step we define is that energy at the system. To define the available energy at the system for the crop, you can use photosynthetic active radiation or solar radiation to use as an input in our system. After that, we can use here the radiation use efficient that will convert our energy in biomass. And for this, we have this example here that based in this fixed parameter for no stress condition, we know how much each part of energy can produce of biomass. So this example for sugarcane, we have here that 3.6 grams are produced for each megajoule that is incident in the location based on the photosynthetic activity radiation. So this is our conception, our model, how we describe this model, use this parameter to make this conversion. So this is the basic. The next step is to define how much time we have this crop in the field intercepting solar radiation and make this conversion of energy to biomass. So the time can be defined using two approaches. The cycle, for example, this case here in Brazil, we have the sugarcane growing from September until May or August when we make this harvest. So we have almost a year that the crop will be in the field growing. Or another approach, I can use the thermal time to define how many days the crop will be in the field based on the air temperature in that region. So here we have a very simple model to use to estimate the biomass produced by sugarcane. And you can see here that depends on our knowledge, we can use two approaches to make the cycle. Use a fixed number of days or use thermal time to define this crop cycle. Okay. So here is a representation of our simple model where I have solar radiation, including photosynthetic activity radiation. So using this input variable, I can convert this solar radiation in photosynthetic activity radiation using the parameter of radiation use efficient. I will produce a dry matter by day that when I integrate this during the total time of the cycle, I have a total dry matter production in this region based in this information. So this is our conceptual and schematic illustration about our model, and now we can include a mathematical equation that represents this relationship that you are using to describe sugarcane growth. So the first step, you need to estimate the photosynthetic activity radiation that in a simple way we can measure this in the field, or you can use solar radiation and make this conversion. About 50% of solar radiation is PAR, okay? So you can make this estimation. After that, when I have this that define here in this table is the radiation use efficiency is estimated based in the photosynthetic activity radiation, I can make this equation here, where dry biomass is the photosynthetic activity radiation multiplied by radiation use efficiency. So based in the amount of par that I have in the system, I can estimate the dry biomass for 1 day, how much was this production. So this is for 1 day I have this dry biomass, but I need to integrate this across the crop cycle. So the dry biomass in this specific day or the total cycle will be the dry biomass that I get in the previous day plus the dry biomass that I calculate in the currently day to make this accumulation across the cycle. At the end, I have only here dry biomass, the total dry biomass. I can make a direct conversion to sugar, where 50% of the dry mass will be the amount of sugar I can produce, or I can convert this dry biomass in total yield in the field, adding 70% of residual unit in the biomass of the sugar cane at the field. So you can see here that using a very simple model, you can estimate the biomass that sugarcane are produced, but you can see also that you have a lot of simple information that in some case when I need a more details about the simulation, I can create a error in my simulation, and we are discussing this in the next slide. Okay. And depend on the level of complex of the model, you can have many equations that are interacting between them. Here we have a simple description of the DSAT model that you are using in the next classes. We are studying specifically this crop model. They divide here in different modules. So here we have the main program that it's responsible to make this dial integration of different variables in the system. We have this central unit that they call land unit model that make this interaction between the integrate time with these different modules that simulate different conditions. For example, we have a module responsible for weather, for management, for soil, for this soil plant atmosphere interaction. Here we have a specific model that are using for legumes crops, the crop grow, and we have another one that is the plant module that have different plant modules that are making the simulation. So, for example, here in the weather, I can make some environmental modification. We use this for make climate change scenarios. In the management, we define the planting, harvest, irrigation, fertilizer, and residue put in the soil. In the soil, we have this all soil dynamics, temperature, soil water, soil nitrogen, and carbon. So these simulations are made in these soil modules. We have this soil plant interaction, soil plant atmosphere interaction that are responsible to connect the soil to the plant and to the atmosphere. For example, we estimate the evapotranspiration based in the weather condition from atmosphere. Based in the leaf area index, we estimate the crop evapotranspiration, and based on this interaction between soil and plant, we calculate how much water the plant are extracting from the soil. So this model is used to do this in our system. Here in the crop grow, we have the soybean, peanuts, dry bean, and a lot of crops that you can explore this after. We also have this plant and this damage that they are not too much developed, but you have this parameter that you can adjust to simulate some effect of pest and disease. And here you have the Gramínea crops, that's maize, wheat, that are also simulated. So this is a very simple representation of this model that you're gonna use in the second half of our course. Here's another example. So we have this different level of crop models. The previous one is a very complex model, but you can use also very simple equation to represent different crop growth condition and get the results that you need. For example, in this study, the question was how much is the grass yield at farm, and they use here different weather and some calculate variables. For example, air temperature, solar radiation, thermal time, crop evapotranspiration, and equation here that include different factors to estimate how much will be the biomass produced by a specific grass in this specific farm. So you can see here that we have, for some cases, for example here, a high R square that represents that the model is very efficient. So using this equation based in the minimum air temperature, solar radiation, and actual crop evapotranspiration, we can estimate this total biomass produced by this grass in this specific field. What is the problem behind these simple models? I don't have too much variables to represent specific another system. For example, I can't get this equation and apply for other field because this equation was built in specific for this condition using only these three input variables to represent total biomass produced by grass. So if I want to make useful this equation, I need to make a validation in another field to make this correct and to see if these are working out in another condition. But for example, this side, I can get some calibration from one region and just update the input information and make the simulation that I need for another region. Okay, so we have these different conditions. And here we have a very simple comparison between a statistical model, that is this example here, that you have a direct relationship between our input and our output from the simulation, comparing with this a deterministic model, a model more complex, that I have a more interaction and more parameters to represent our system. That is the case of this art that you are going to use in the future. So here you can see that based in this complexity of the model, I have an error in the predict variable that I want to analyze. For example, in a statistical model, I have a very low complexity, and in this case, the systematic error is the main component and is very high because I'm not representing very well our system. I'm looking for a very simple image from our system, and a lot of things that are important for the final result are not included, are not being representing in our system, and because this can create a systematic error because this not good representation of our system. But for the another point here, for models too complex, that you have a lot of complexity, I am representing very well our system because I'm including the biochemical, all relationships that you have in the plant, all relationships that you have in our system, all variables that you can look at the soil, each specific interaction we are representing our system. So we don't have a systematic error, but we have a high calibration error. What this means? That we are representing very well the components and the interaction in the system, but I have a challenge that is make a calibration for each equation that represents the system that are being interact in our system, each component that are interaction. So this can make to lead us to create a error in the model because we have a good representation, but you don't have a good calibration in the model. And this occurs because most of these variables I can measure. For example, how you can make the cost for the crop to make a photosynthesis in a very specific level, small level. We cannot measure this very easily. So because this, we have this error associated with calibration. So you need to find something here in the middle that we have a minimal representation of our system, but this representation can be calibrated very well to avoid error in the simulation. So you try also to find a model that is near this point here where the total error is small. Okay. So after this introduction and some example, we have some terms that we use in the modeling that it's important to us to define and then look more with more details for these terms. The first one we talk a little bit, that is the system. That the system is any part of the universe in which we are interested. A system consists of components that have interaction with each other in the environment. So when you look for the system, you look for these specific components. You need to look how they are interaction between them to represent in a better way the equation that you are using to simulate. So here we have an example of a very simple system that we have here two components, the crop plant and the soil, and these two components are being interaction between them. For example, the soil is affecting crop plant and the crop is affecting the soil. They have this interaction. You need two equations to represent these two flux of interaction. But outside of our system, here defined by this dashed line, we have another things that are outside of the system, and you can see that the arrow is just from outside to inside, representing that the soil environment, the management, the biotic environment, and weather are affecting the soil and the crop plant, but soil and the crop plant are not affecting these components that are outside of our system. So these represent our system. You need also look careful for this component when you are building a new model or when you are using some specific model. For example, in the case of the crop growth, we don't look for these variables outside of the system. We just use these variables to affect the crop growth. But when you are looking for a climate model, for example, the weather is inside of the system, and you look how the crop and the soil are affecting the weather. So we have these different steps occurring in this model, and where the weather are affecting the crop plant, and another day the evapotranspiration of the plant are affecting the weather. So depends on the level of simulation, we can have these different components in the system, and they can be inside or outside of the system. It's important to highlight that the components outside are affecting and are not being affected by the components inside of the model. The next definition is the model. The model is a description of the system that allows examination of the components of the system. So we have this description, how our system works, and you have this four classification that you saw previously that define each type of model we using. The next one is the modeling. That is the process of building or developing a model to bring together the function that describe the components of the resultant in the model. So in the next class, we're gonna talk about each one is the steps that you need to define to building a model, and this process is the modeling. You are looking for a problem. We need to define each components are important to solve our problem, how they are interacting, After that, you need to define this equation to find parameters to define this equation. After that, you need to programming this, and in the end, to look if all these steps are working well, looking for a final result. So this is the process of the modeling to building this model. The simulation is the act of executing a model and obtain the output about the variables of interest. So it's just the process to make the simulation and look for the results. And the system analysis is the act of taking the results of the simulation and make a synthesized conclusion that can be drawn from the simulation results. So you make simulation, get the results, and make this analysis, and you can use this to define if our model is good enough to make more simulation, or it's good enough to solve our problem or give information to us to make a better decision in the system. So here is an example of a system analysis. This is the example of our simple model about sugarcane, where they plot here the cumulative growth here in grams by square meter across the crop cycle. So after each day, we have this accumulation of dry biomass, and you can see here that after around 200 days, we have this biomass being produced in the system. So this is a very simple crop model. And here we have a more complexity analysis make for this researcher that analyze for the future climate how is the response for with in different scenarios using different crop models. So here we have 3 levels of CO2, and here we have 3 levels of air temperature increase, and here we have this simulated relative change in the wheat yield. So you can see here that in these different scenarios, we have this variability in function of the crop model they are using for 2 locations. Okay, here in India and Australia, and you can see that, for example, here with a high CO2 level, we have an increase in the yield for India when you have no increase in the air temperature, but when you increase 6 degrees Celsius the temperature, we have a reduction of yield here around, in the average of these 27 models that they use, we have this mean result is around 20% less yield in this scenario. Okay, so we can use this information to make a plan for the future, looking for new cultivars or management to avoid this yield loss by climate change. Another point is that inside the model we can have different variables, and you need to look carefully for this variable because they are important to know the model and to understand how this model works. So the variable is a symbolic name given to some null or unknown quantity or value, proposing to allow the name to be used independent of the value it represents. For here we have 4 variables. The first one is state variables that indicate the current status of the system. For example, every day you have this update in this information, so you need to these variables to define how are the system in this exact moment. For example, when we started the simulation, we have a very low leaf area index, and this affected the solar radiation interception. The next day, when we have 1 day of the crop growth, this leaf area index will be updated, and this update of the leaf area index value will affect the solar radiation intercept in the next day. So you need to have these state variables that are being updated every day or every time that the model are using to simulate to describe how our system are in that specific moment. We have the rate variables that define the rate or speed of change in a state variable. For example, we have the rate of transpiration, the rate of leaf area expansion, photosynthesis rate, and all these rates are defined based in the state variables, in parameters, and the driving variables. Uh, so the system are changed every time that the simulation is updated. The parameters are the characteristic of the system, and their values usually remain constant during a simulation. For example, in our sugarcane model, we use the radiation use efficiency. This is a stable parameter and don't change the parameter along the cross cycle. So this is a parameter specific for sugarcane. We can update this value, for example, if you include the water depth effect. So you can make a component with radiation use efficient and a component water balance. And based on the water depth, we can analyze this radiation use efficient parameter. This is one approach that you can use to update the value of this specific parameter. And you also have the driving variables that are environmental variables that can affect the rate variables. For example, air temperature, rainfall, solar radiation are variables that are outside of the system and are affecting the components inside of the system. And to make easily to us to understand, here we have an example from our system. We have here our driving variables, so weather, soil management. This is all information that I need to inform for the model and put as an input in the system, so you need to measure this. I have here the parameters and just some example. Photosynthesis rate at potential condition, photoperiod sensitivity, thermal time are all parameters that in most cases they are constant across the crop cycle. For example, for soybean in DSAT we have at least 18 parameters for each cultivar that we are using in the system. To make our simulation more easily, we also have these plant organs, leaf, roots, stem, flowers, fruits that are used to divide the biomass produced across the day. So if I have a total of biomass, part of this total biomass go to our component of leaf, and this biomass is converting to leaf area index that is our state variable for the next day in the system. We have this process and rate variables, transpiration, photosynthesis, respiration, root growth, biomass parting that are based in this rate. We have the state variables, leaf area, root depth, crop stage, that are information that are updated every day, and every day this new value affect the process in our system. And we have these outputs from the model that can include biomass, yield, leaf area index, or another thing that we want to represent in our system. Okay. And when you are building a model or looking for some system, we use some symbol to represent these different variables. For example, when you are making a schematic representation of a system, you can use this symbol to driving variable, or use this one for crop parameter, or this one for rate variable. So you can build this model using this information. And here we have example for a very simple model that represents the biomass produced by maize, including here the thermal time to define leaf area index. We have here, for example, a driving variable that is air temperature, we have here a rate that is thermal time by day. This will affect the emission of crop leaf in the main stem, and all this will affect the leaf area index here in the system. We have here A and B are crop parameters, so you can use this symbol to make a better representation of the system that you are simulating and each process are occurring. So for example, here the temperature and thermal time, the base temperature are affecting the thermal time, and the thermal time will affect the emission of leaf based on the phylochrome. And after we have this demand stand node number that will affect the, the plant leaf area based in these two parameters. In the end, we have the leaf area index based in this another parameter here that is the plant density. So using this information, you can build a schematic crop model more easily in the system. There is another approach also used to make this representation. Here we have an example from Forrester that uses these components. For example, here is the level of material that is stored in the compartment. We have this a symbol for rate of transport in the system. We have this another sets and things that can define our model. In the chapter that I sent to you, we have these details about each arrow and each square, what means each one this condition. And here we have an example showing how this can work for a simple maize crop grow model based on thermal time, leaf area index, and biomass that they are producing this system. So we have these components that are our driving variables that are affecting the rate of leaf area index increase based in this parameter. This will affect here the temperature, that will affect the thermal time, that will affect the growth here in the model. So we can define here that in this equation we have here thermal time based in the minimum and the maximum temperature and the base temperature for maize. We can calculate this. After we have this growth of leaf area index based in this thermal time in function of these driving variables. And here we have the biomass production based in the leaf area, in the radiation use efficient, the leaf area index that will affect the interception, and here for this specific thermal time we use in this equation, and in this case when the thermal time is higher than this variable, the value for this is 0. And these all processes are repeated every day to make this thermal time accumulation, the leaf area index increase across the cycle, and the biomass production. So here we have the value for today, the actual value, plus the variation that you have from to another day for get this new value in the next day. The same thing we do for thermal time, for leaf area index, and for biomass. And here we can bring all details for this equation in this representativity of the model. We have all definition here. So a good model always have this table, bring all definition of the explanatory variables, state variables, parameters, and the specific meaning of each parameter in the model that we are using, right? So this we have more detail about this definition in this chapter and the other books that I share with you in this class. After that, we also have another definition about these mathematical models. The mathematical models represent process, and we talk a little about statistical and mechanistic model. So the mechanistic model represents a process putting in our system the cause and effects represented by equation to create this model. And we also have the statistical model that is a simple relationship between two variables. For example, yield will be affected by rain in this specific period that you define in the equation. But our model have some level of empirical process in the system. What is this empirical process? They are simplification of the real system. Remember previously when you talk about the error in the model, depends on the complexity of the model, you can have a low or high error. So when we don't know to advance to explain in more details the process because you don't can calibrate this model very well, we create some empirical function to simplify this process, and these all models have some level of empirical process. And here is an example comparing the statistical with a mechanistic model. So when start here for one plant, we can go to organ and biochemistry and in very specific details how the plant works. We have some extra variables to explain this interaction. We integrate these results and you get the plant results. So we have this real process occurring here to define the plant growth, for example. In a statistical model, we forgot all this interaction here in this process, and you go direct from plant to plant result based on a simple mathematical relation. And in the deterministic model, we are not so simple like a statistical model, but not so much complex how the real process in the plant. So here, what do? We go a little deep near the organ, the chemistry, and came here for the extra variables and arrive here in the plant result. So this represents how the models works based in the level of the interaction that you have in the system. We have two types of model also, static versus dynamic. The static model not consider elements in time. So for example, when you have this relation between yield and rainfall, we don't have an update based on time. We don't look for this, just the final results. In another way, the dynamic model, he can predict the future state of the model based on difference in the differential equation. For example, here, the thermal time for maize, we can use the current thermal time plus this differential between 2 times, and you can update this variable in the next day. The same thing for the fair index, in the same thing for Biomats. We have the discrete and continuous model. The discrete represents the result in integrate time, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4 days, and the continuous, the results can be obtained at any time, like 2.3 days. So this depends on the level of the growth that you want to describe, and most of model we work with this step of days, for example, 1, 2, 3 days. In some case, we have these continuous results. For example, in DSAT, the outputs are at the daily step, but internal, we have some simulation that is made by hour to make a better representation of the system. We have these deterministic and stochastic models. Most of models of crop growing, they are deterministic, that they have a set of unique variables determined by the parameter in the model, and will always have the same performance if the same initial condition were provided. For example, if I make a simulation using the DSAT here in my computer, and you use the same model to make the same simulation using the same version and the same input information, you're gonna get the same result. this is deterministic model. You don't have change of the result if one or other people are making simulation using the same condition. In another way, the stochastic models, they are more used for climate condition where we have a probability of distribution. So this model generates the results based in a probabilistic level, and if I run one time or two, the results will be different because this inserted, because this probability of distribution that this model use internally to make this simulation. So they are used more in climate simulation when one predict weather variables, for example. And to finish our class, I like to bring this impact phrase that talk about the crop modeling. The first one is models are not the reality. We saw that we just make an image from our system to represent this model. So if I building a model or you building a model, maybe you have a different conception of the world or the system that we are using, and this create different results, different approach. You can saw that different authors can use the same driving variables to get the same output, but in this middle that were defined equation, we can use different approach to calculate the, the outputs in the model. Models offer a simple image of the real world, so the crop is very complex, but we can represent this until a defined level. After that, it's too hard to make calibration or measure variables or parameters to put in our equation. So we have a simple image that you need not to be so simple, but not be too complex because we need to minimize our error in the simulation. Models are a tool to interpret and understand the result from experiment and field. So they are a tool. I like to say this, that models are a tool. They are not the reality, and they not give to us the result that you would just look to do this result and follow without question. We need to look for the results to understand what our model are doing, each system will represent, if this model is adequate for this system, if the model are representing all factors that are affecting my results in the system. And the models cannot be developed without a set of hypotheses, and the results need to be tested in various environments. So when you're building a model or use a model, we have a hypothesis behind this model that can affect our results. You need to understand this and test this model for different conditions in a proper way. And during this course, we will talk about each type of data I need to collect, each type of model I can use based on my question that I want to answer, how many data I need, each information I need to put in the model. So we are building this information across our course, right? So this way I finished this first class about the concept of the crop modeling. About the application, we have a lot of example of different papers that building these models that use this model for different purposes. So be open to find any article that can help you to understand why you are doing this course, which is your aim using the crop modeling, right? Any question, please send an email to me, and I see you next week.